Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Centre for Global Higher Education and seminar 253, which is quite a number. Now, the topic today is the outcomes of higher education, a cross-cultural dialogue between Anglo-American and Chinese worlds. And the first part of the title of the seminar is a question, which suggests it's going to be a really interesting kind of engagement. So today we'll be hearing from a kind of lead presentation from two of our presenters, Simon Marginson and Lili Yang. And then we'll be going across, so Simon and Lili are both at the University of Oxford. Then we'll be going to our colleagues who are going to engage with the work of Simon and Lili's paper. Just to say that paper and the interlocutors make up a special issue of Globalisation, Societies and Education, which will be coming out in 2022. In fact, it'll be the first issue of that journal and so the number it'll be volume 21 and issue number 1. So our interlocutors with Simon and Lili are Ruth Hayhoe, welcome Ruth, from the University of Toronto, Xin Xu from the University of Oxford, and my lovely longtime colleague from the University of Hong Kong, and that's Yang Rui. So welcome. So before I hand over to the presenters to take the lead on their 20-minute introduction, what I want to do is just to make some brief housekeeping points. And so you'll see some of those actually in front of you. So please note that the Zoom is going to be recorded. And so we just assume that that's absolutely fine for everyone. So this webinar will be recorded. Please keep yourself muted unless you're asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. And we recommend that you use speaker view, which you can actually find in the top right-hand corner so that you can more clearly see who's actually speaking. To ask a question, please use the chat function and write out the question you wish to ask. And at the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, and so I'll be, as the chair, curating the selection, you'll be invited to speak directly. So please unmute yourself, tell us who you are, switch on your video, state your name and where you're from. And pretty much that's, we're in business and now ready to go. So can I actually ask our two presenters, Simon and Lili, the floor is yours. So you have roughly about 20 minutes, and that's just going to take us to slightly past 20 past, and I'll give you a little bit of a warning. Then we're going to go to each of our interlocutors who will have about 6 minutes each, and audience, welcome everyone, but you'll have roughly about 20 minutes, perhaps slightly a little bit more than that, to engage with what I know will be a really stimulating presentation. So Simon, Lili, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Susan. I hope everyone can see my screen now. Well, my name is Lili Yang, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. It's really an honor and a privilege to be with a group of brilliant scholars today. Well, in the next 20 minutes or so, Simon and I will approach the question of what are the outcomes, especially collective outcomes of higher education through the Anglo-American and Chinese lenses. And I start with the research background and the method of transpositional analysis. And then I'll hand over to Simon to introduce the Chinese approach and the comparative and transpositional assessment. As Susan has introduced, our presentation will primarily draw on our symposium paper, which is already online, and the printed issue will be coming out next year. Well, let's move on to the main topic. We all agree that higher education produces both individualized and collective outcomes, but it remains unclear what these outcomes are and how we can understand them. Collective outcomes are particularly difficult to capture and understand, largely because of the problem of observation and interpretation. For example, there is a question of how to assess and compute the contributions of higher education such as social tolerance. Also, the answers to these questions can vary across contexts and across cultures, depending on, for example, the social cultural imaginary of the society in which higher education is embedded. In this paper, what we attempt to do is to compare Anglo-American and Chinese approaches to the outcomes with the objective to developing a more comprehensive understanding of the outcomes of higher education. In particular, we developed a methodology of transpositional analysis based on Amartya Sen's transpositionality. This transpositional approach involves 3 steps. First, it rejects the comparison based on a single cultural standpoint or position. And then it explores multiple positions, in our case, the Anglo-American and the Chinese positions. Third, it develops a transpositional assessment of the observations based on multiple positions. And our presentation today also follows this methodological approach, as we start with 2 separate explorations of the Anglo-American and Chinese positions, and then move on to the transpositional assessment. Let's look at the Anglo-American approach first. The diagram here illustrates the Anglo-American social cultural imaginary. Rooted in distributed political agency in Republican Rome, the division of powers is an essential characteristic of Western governance. Even though there have been periodic attempts to establish absolute rule, the Western state is essentially a limited state, and modern Anglo-American society is divided between government and state, the economic market, public civil society, and the individual who enjoys an ill-defined normative primacy. And the boundary between the state and the other spheres is endemically contested, tense, and unstable. Anti-statism is a core theme of critical political discourse, especially in the United States. Individual freedom is primarily defined as freedom from state coercion, which is negative freedom. The primacy of negative freedom overshadows positive freedom, which is grounded in the capability to act and achieve goals. If we look at the university, we know that the medieval university emerged as semi-independent with partial institutional autonomy from church and state and the monopoly of scholarship, which evolved into academic freedom. In modern times, government reasserted itself, but a regulated university autonomy, which is codified in the Humboldtian ideal and its take-up in the US university survived. As always in the Anglo-American politics, there is ongoing tension at the border with the state, but the university has proven resilient and flexible. I would also like to highlight a distinct difference between the Anglo-American and Chinese approach, which is related to their views on individuals and individualism and collectivism. For the Anglo-American approach, personal liberty is imagined as a distinctive space. In ideal conditions, each person enjoys absolute self-realization as long as no other person is harmed. Underlying this is the idea of self-regulating liberal individuals who can sustain self-regulating communities. As Simon will expand later, in contrast to the Anglo-American approach, the Chinese approach highlights collectivism. Then, if we move on to the Anglo-American notions of public, we identified 2 meanings of public. The first is the public-private zero-sum dualism, and the other is a communicative inclusive public. And let's look at them one by one. The first, public and private dualism. The Anglo-American public-private dualism assumes a zero-sum relationship between the public and private, and primarily takes 2 forms. In one usage, public means government or state, as in the terms such as public sector. It's distinct from the private spheres of home, family, economic market, and corporate sector. In the Anglo-American politics, there is no consensus on the extent of government provision and funding, and that debate is partly regulated by the second public-private dualism from economics. In the economic dualism, public goods stands for non-market production, as distinct from private goods produced in economic markets. Goods are public when market-based production cannot generate a profit because the goods concerned are non-exclusive and or non-rivalrous. public goods must be financed by states or philanthropy. Well, in higher education, Anglo-American policy economics consigns non-market higher education to a residual role. Economics has no great means of calculating the value of collectively consumed and produced outcomes, such as the joint contributions of educated persons to social and international relations. But there has been pushback against the narrow version of the economic agenda. For example, there are advocates of the arts and humanities who assert social and cultural values. There is also the argument for going beyond the limits of human capital theory and focusing on the broader formation of persons in and through higher education. All such currents find themselves working against the grain of the economic ministries and the media focus on graduate employability and salary levels. The second usage of public refers to broad, inclusive, and universal assembly and open communications. This public is not opposed to the private. Rather, the public setting provides conditions for social interaction between individuals. The inclusive communicative public has several resonances in higher education. For example, Amartya Sen notes that education is essential to democratic agency. Craig Calhoun presents universities in Habermas terms as semi-autonomous adjuncts of government that harbor constructive criticism, policy ideas, and transformative social movements. Notably grounded in Western European civic democracy, UNESCO has developed the notion of common good in education that emphasizes the normative and agentic. The notion of common goods emphasizes shared welfare and the fostering of values such as solidarity, inclusion, tolerance, universal freedoms, and equality. Both government and non-government organizations contribute to the production of common goods. However, common goods have greater salience in Western European polities than the English-speaking world. Then let's look at the global level. We found that Anglo-American political cultures struggle to imagine goods beyond the national border. If we follow the public-private dualism, then public goods require a state, but there's no global state. And we know that universities can range beyond national borders. But this is the conceptual void of the global, as when doing so, they are defined as private corporations. Perhaps, and as Simon will elaborate later, the Chinese idea of tianxia, all under heaven, provides an alternative approach to the world and global good. To summarize the Anglo-American approach, there is the loose, ill-defined primacy of individual. Beyond the individual, there is no essential primacy of state, market, and civil society, and the division between them varies by quality. Lines between government and other spheres, including higher education, are tense. In higher education, the economics of public-private goods forces a trade-off between individual benefits and joint and collective benefits. This will limit the scope for collective goods and defines individual benefits as atomic and not relational. The core responsibility of the state is reduced to the residual collective goods. Anything more than that is left to institutions and individual actors. Perhaps the only exception in higher education is policy on social inclusion. Well, that's the Anglo-American approach. And now, Simon, would you like to come in to discuss the Chinese approach?
Thanks, Lily, and well done on the time. Now to the Chinese thinking about the outcomes of higher education. This has two roots: the indigenous tradition, the long indigenous tradition of Sinic scholarship and statecraft, and the multiple and hybrid modern China impacted by Westernization. The roots of China's political culture are in the Zhou dynasty, governance, Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. The model is integrated, not with a division of powers, as in the West. China's imaginary consists of nested circles, ascending from local spheres to wider spheres. The larger spheres have normative primacy over the smaller spheres. This privileges social order and the larger kinship family and state as embodiments of order. Relations between each pairing of smaller and larger sphere, such as the pairing of individual and family or state, society, and tianxia, are pairings of gong and si, Gong has multiple meanings, including non-individual, public, common, universal, openness, fairness, all people, and the state. C variously connects to private, personal, selfish, and secret. Gong and seat correlates roughly to public and private in English in one way. A move from a smaller to a larger circle is a move to greater publicness. There are also differences. In the Anglo-American public-private dualism, public and private each signify unique essences that cannot coincide, and individual liberty might be valued above universal benefit. Gong and Si are coexistent and relational. Gong includes Si, and Gong has primacy over Si. Next slide, please. In Confucian thought, an absolute self, separate from society, is impossible. The Confucian self is a relational and role-bearing individual, successively embedded in family, state, and tianxia. A central value is Confucian ethical formation via self-cultivation, the work of the self on the self, first in the family and then in education. A key moment is the formation in every child, typically at the age of 6 or 7 years, of Liji, the reflective commitment or will to learn. Confucian learning is about how to live in a relational setting as a social being. The intrinsic preference for the outer sphere over the inner sphere is the foundation of Sinic collectivism. There is no zero-sum dualism of individual and collective, nor is the individual suppressed. The key is the embeddedness at each level. If there is continued conflict between public and private interests, the larger collective is supreme. But many scholars argue C is under-recognized in China and the individual is insufficiently protected. Next slide. China's state is not a limited liberal state, but comprehensive and centralizing, and able to intervene at need in any domain. This was not an invention of the Communist Party. In the Zhou dynasty, state power and politics were supreme over the land-owning aristocracy, the merchants, the cities, the professions, religion, and importantly, the military. The Qin dynasty created the central state. But in this governance arrangement, social order, defense, and prosperity are essential to the maintenance of state legitimacy. Instead of a formal division of powers, as in Euro-America, China's state evolved forms of deep devolution, subject to central authority. And this is true of higher education as in other sectors. Typically, the state oscillated between periods of greater freedom and opening up, deregulation, and periods of tighter central control. Civil society in China was always smaller, more intermittent, more managed, more supervised by the state. Correspondingly, discussion inside the broad state is typically widespread and active, although not fully transparent to everyone. All of these features of Chinese governance continue today. Higher education took a different path to that in Europe. The imperial academies prepared scholar officials distributed across China as leaders at central, provincial, and district levels. Next slide, please. Tianxia means the unified human and natural sphere, held together by culture and values that transcend racial and geographical boundaries. Some scholars emphasize unity in diversity, here Bhutan. Tianxia Wei Gong, all under heaven belongs to all, suggests global common good. China moved ahead in imagining the global and the ecological. However, tianxia has various meanings. It can mean Chinese civilization and beyond, with China at the center, and it can be mobilized as it is at present to support sort of a nationalist agenda. But it can also mean the whole world and everything in it without a necessary center. Next slide, please. Now, things are always changing, as Heraclitus said, and as Marx said, they change in terms of the past. In modern times, the ascending Confucian circles no longer fully describe the social order in China. The autonomous individual and the state have both become stronger. Gong and Xi are less stable than they were before. The CPC is organised on the basis of Leninist democratic centralism, enabling a small group of leaders to steer the party state, control the devolved structures, and micromanage the population more closely than in imperial times, though intensive surveillance is a burden to all, not least, and the state itself. Under Mao Zedong, rural communes and urban work units, Danwei, weakened kinship networks and conflated state and society. Then the decollectivization, economic growth and enrichment under Deng Xiaoping fostered individuality via markets and the disembedding of migrant workers from families and social obligations. Yet people are still mostly nested in networks based in kin, ethnicity, region, school, work, party, profession, and guild structures. Next slide, please. China now has the world's largest tertiary education system and science system. Leninist centralism has combined Western modernization with Chinese tradition. The universities look like their Anglo-American counterparts in their degree structures, curricula, the doctorate, and corporate organization, but they continue the imperial mission, preparing graduates for the state and producing instrumental knowledge focused on national needs. As in the Song dynasty, provincial and university leaders are trained in party schools and distributed by the central state, which maintains control over them. Dual authority in the universities with party secretaries alongside specialist leaders at every level has antecedents in the Ming. China's universities have been westernized, not by external colonization, but by a state-driven project of catch-up. The resulting tensions are self-imposed and can be tuned by the party state. University autonomy and academic freedom play out within the boundaries of the state, not on the boundary between the state and society, as in the West. Universities are not simply subordinated to the state. They exercise jizhu, self-mastery, while interacting with the central state. Faculty accept state regulation as positive, generally speaking, and contribute autonomously to state policy. Next slide, please. In China's universities, there's a strong sense of an enlarged public as state. Tuition fees in corporate universities do not imply a more limited agenda for the state or reduce the scope or obligation of higher education to generate collective outcomes. There's no necessary tension between the collectivist ethic and individual self-betterment through education. But the communicative, inclusive public is underdeveloped, and this means there's limited scope for universities as critical public spheres. Faculty and students speak freely only behind closed doors inside the party state. They join to broader civil and political society only episodically and sometimes with tragic results. Next slide, please. Now, the table summarizes the differences of approach to society, state, and the individual and collective outcomes of higher education. The traditions do not closely align. The Anglo-American public-private dualism appears in discussions of higher education financing in China, but it's a secondary theme, and it's not seen to limit the state or the potential for collective goods. In relation to the public as government, in China, state action in higher education is seen to provide universal collective goods, but in Anglo-America, the potentials of state action are seen as limited. The state is seen to encroach on the individual who's separated from the social and protected by the public-private dualism. Public and universal in Anglo-America is mostly a spillover from market transactions subordinated to private individualized outcomes, which are seen to have superior value. The Anglo-American practice of the communicative public, the democratic assembly, the public space is separated from the state executive, fades from view in China. There's a closer equivalence, perhaps, between tianxia wei gong in China and the Anglo-American idea of global common good, but the latter is mostly marginal in the English-speaking world. I think China could achieve a better balance between the individual and collective than it has. There's no essential tension between the individual and common benefits of higher education. But China misses the potential of higher education in social communication and criticism. While in Anglo-America, the tension is between individual and collective, in China, it's between the state monopoly of the social and other forms of collective agency and other collective forums. Anglo-American discourse and policy perhaps are now tending towards a more extreme economic individualism and exclusion of the public and collective, except in research. Broader person formation gets little attention. It gets much more attention in China. Social equity in higher education in the Anglo-American world means access to private goods with less attention to distribution and justice. Yet the relational public suggests in Anglo-America a more advanced role for higher education in networks and inclusion beyond economic public goods. Last slide, please. Can transpositional analysis help us to find a position that integrates the two discourses of higher education outcomes? Well, I think we can go a long way towards doing this. No, neither of the separate traditions by itself provides a basis for transposition. However, the assertions and omissions in each political culture, while culturally specific and not universal, suggest components of an integrated position. The Anglo-American tradition highlights the individual, distinguishes state from society, and foregrounds civil forums and organizations. The Chinese tradition distinguishes the individual and the family, highlights the collective, emphasizes the state as positive rather than a subtraction from the non-state, and nominates tianxia. Now, all of these components arguably can be part of a transpositional viewpoint. The one element from the two traditions that's not included in the combined table is the Anglo-American public-private dualism, which drives so much else in the English-speaking world. This economic dualism is incompatible with transpositionality because it suppresses much of the potential for collective outcomes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to the responses and the discussion. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you so much, Simon, and really appreciated, Simon and Lili, your presentation. Can we now go to Ruth Hayhoe, who has about 5 minutes to engage with the presentation. The longer versions, of course, are out on the internet, published out there at the moment on the DLI for Globalisation, Societies and Education. Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Susan. What a privilege to be here and part of this dialogue. And I have been following it actually quite closely with both Lili and Simon for quite some time and been so inspired. More than 50 years of my life has been dedicated to trying to explain some of the richness of China's culture and its higher education traditions to the Western world, a very difficult task. So I just focus on the issue of language. And I'm so pleased to see how Simon and Lili have dealt with that and how difficult it is for us in the Anglo-American world without a knowledge of the language to really grasp the depth of some of the concepts. Not highlighted, but is in the paper, the individual in Chinese, the small self, xiaohua. And then of course, the dahua, the big self. Quite different from our concept of individual. A Chinese child becomes a person when they are 1 month old and there is a recognition with their whole family around them and they're given a name. A social being with responsibility as against our individual. Right, so that's one of the things you can learn so much from. And then you move immediately to the Dahua. And Simon said a lot about the all under heaven, tianxia wei gong, and the common good. And I think that's another deep aspect of children growing up in China. They feel part not only of their family, their community, their nation, but indeed of the whole natural world. And this connects so beautifully to all the issues right now around ecology and our common destiny with all that is living. So I'm just trying to emphasize a few points where I think the West could learn very deeply from this very, very rich Chinese tradition. The second one I want to go on to, and this was mentioned, the whole issue of autonomy and the strong sense in the West that Chinese scholars have to do what they're told. There's no real autonomy in Chinese universities, such as we've had legally with the charters of institutions and so on. And we know that's changed a lot in the modern period, as Simon pointed out in the Chinese context as well. But I think the key element here is 自主. Instead of 自治, 自治 means self-governance. 自治 means self-mastery. Chinese scholars are responsible for the state. They're not simply subordinate to a state that tells them what to do, but they feel a tremendous responsibility. And the cost has been even greater than the cost of academic freedom and autonomy in the Western history. So another, I think, very core point for us to reflect on and learn from. And then finally, the last thing, and I'm so glad this was mentioned by Simon, 和而不同, a very famous Chinese phrase, harmony without conformity. Our dialectic, coming out of the European rational tradition, going into Marxism and so on, always requires a synthesis. You've got the thesis, you've got the antithesis, and then you're driven to a synthesis. China has a dialectic with no synthesis, with thousands of years in which opposites parallel and interact with one another. There's no need to synthesize, there's no need to integrate. And I think that's one of the most difficult things for the Western world to learn. You can see behind me 2 scrolls which have accompanied me for 40 years since I was a young teacher at Fudan University. One is in the very formal Lishu, the formal Confucian style strict script, and the other is in the Caochu, the fluent kind of script. And they represent ideas coming from Confucianism and Taoism, never synthesized, but allowing a flexibility of thought and understanding that is often surprising. And that's what I'd like us to learn from in the West. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity just to share a few thoughts with all of you. Thank you.
With what wonderful insights, and from a scholar who actually is just a fabulous scholar of China over the long haul. So can I just remind you, if you've just spoken, turn off your mic, and we're now just going to go to Xin Xu. So Xin Xu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Susan. So I'm now sharing my screen and I hope it's visible.
It is, thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much again for Simon and Lili's really rich and stimulating presentation and the paper. Thank you also for Ruth for the really insightful comments. It is such a privilege for me to be able to engage with discussion and with this amazing panel. And I take it as a really valuable learning opportunity. And following up with the discussion, I will briefly reflect on the value, challenges, and outcomes of the cross-cultural comparison, and particularly in light with the discussions about epistemic diversity in the global research. And firstly, I think the transpositional approach in the paper is truly valuable. And because it compared the Anglo-American and Chinese standpoints without privileging either of them, and returning to the Latin etymology of the English word compare, which is shown on the left side of the screen, it highlights equal respect and attention. And interestingly, the Chinese equivalent bi, meaning compare, also delivers the same message about equality, as it is a pictographic character, as you can see here, originally denoting 2 people positioned side by side. I'm interested in learning more about the connotations of the word compare in other languages too. So here we can see equality is very important in comparisons, and it's valuing that the global research space is still highly stratified and unequal. Despite a wealth of normative views in scholarships about epistemic justice and diversity, the fact is that global research is becoming more and more diversified, but also still largely dominated by so-called Western knowledges, cultures, and paradigms. So the framework on this screen demonstrates the unequal power relations in terms of the research structure, knowledge, and knowledge agents. Against this backdrop, solid comparative a solid like cross-cultural comparisons that highlight non-dominating knowledges and cultures, such as the Chinese culture in this case, demonstrate that the epistemic diversity is not just something desirable, but also viable and possible. And secondly, I want to reflect on several challenges of the cross-cultural comparisons that manifest in Lili and Simon's paper. The first major challenge is to generalize each culture, which is intrinsically difficult because each culture is complex and it evolves over time and diffuse across borders. And this speaks to both the Anglo-American side and also the Chinese side in this paper. It is valuable to have a certain level of generalization to have meaningful dialogues and comparisons. However, there are rooms for further nuances. For instance, the current discussion about the Chinese traditional culture is very comprehensive, but it's largely rooted in the Confucianism discussions. And this may be enriched with discussions of other schools of thoughts, for instance, like legalism, that also embodied discussions about the public and the private. And the second major challenge is the deductive applications of the comparative results to individuals. For instance, being Chinese can mean several things. It means Chinese nationality, ethnicity, ancestry, family, etc., etc. So one Chinese student may be fundamentally different from another Chinese student. Therefore, this is just a very gentle reminder for the readers who are engaging with Simon and Lili's paper that we should note that, for instance, not all Anglo-Americans, institutions and individuals embrace individualism, and not all Chinese, for instance, are self-cultivating. And the third major challenge concerns the question of agency, autonomy, justice, and ownership of knowledge in the comparison, which I've discussed in the previous slide. And here I want to highlight that mutual learning and mutual respect will be helpful in facilitating the cross-cultural comparisons and dialogues. And mutual learning grows out of ethical grounds where it needs to be nurtured with intellectual humility and humbleness and mutual respect and an open mindset to different sets of cultures. And the final major challenge, as Ruth also highlighted, is that some seemingly universal concepts, terminologies, discourses, and languages do not always mobilize easily across the different cultural context. I think the comprehensive examination of the public and gong and private and si in the paper is a telling example. So the non-correspondence makes comparisons valuable because if everything the same everywhere, then what's the point of making the comparisons? But they also create challenges, which Simon and Lili have addressed in their paper as well. And in terms of the outcomes of the cultural encounters, and also inspired by Simon and Lili's paper, here I summarize 5 kinds of normative understandings of the results of them. And one of them is also highlights the 和而不同 idea. So the results can be placed on a spectrum depending on how much the differences remain and how much there's a level of integrations across different cultures. I won't expand on this because there might open up another rabbit hole, but fuller discussions are in the paper listed here. And finally, to conclude, at the end of Lili and Simon's paper, they have suggested to extend the comparison beyond the Anglo-American and the Chinese worlds. And I strongly echo this proposal, and I think the CG project is doing exactly the same of expanding the discussions of the public across around 10, please correct me if I'm wrong, around 10 systems in the world. And I really hope and look forward to seeing more and more cross-cultural bridges and then more and more meaningful dialogues and mutual learning that happens, not just about the discussions about higher education, but also beyond. And with this note, I will hand over to Professor Yang, and I really look forward to hearing his insights.
Thank you, Xin Xu. That was really interesting. Can we go to our last presenter, and that's Yang Rui, University of Hong Kong.
Thank you, Susan. And also thank you, Xuxing. First time for me to see you, although via Zoom. Simon and Lili, thank you very much. I read the paper many times, and it's really deep, really rich. I learned a lot. And Ruth just mentioned, for many people from non-Western background, and people learn a lot from the paper. I'm from Chinese background, and I'm reasonably highly educated. I still learn a lot. Let me make a few observations. Mainly my puzzlement rather than, my frustration to some extent. Ever since Western, so-called Western and East met in early encounters, this became a topic. And among the Chinese intellectuals, Liang Qitao, for example, particularly at that time when the Chinese learning met the Western, and the leading scholars began to observe, to question these kind of issues, public good, Chinese traditional values, virtue, private virtue, all these. So it is actually an old topic. And the topic became, the debate became much more heated during last century, late last century, 1990s, and particularly 2000s, with many leading intellectuals in all Chinese societies and in Western societies, those Chinese, and many sinologists too, of non-Chinese background. They participate in this debate. It's continuing. And so, but if you look at the literature, very few people talk about higher education. Amazing, very few. So you really make a huge contribution to our field. And I want to raise a few questions of, as I said, puzzlement or frustrations. I think when I mentioned this in my response in the paper, I think it would be deeper. It would be more helpful if you pay more attention to the changes, the evolution of these ideas. You know, it's not always the same. When we say the Chinese, it's really different. You know, Mencius, how Mencius define the virtue, personal virtue, and Zhu Xi, for example, and all the way to Kang Youwei, for example, the Qing dynasty, huge change. And a major scholar, just an example, a later one, not really late, but Huang Zhongxi, for example, and they all have very different views. So if you pay more attention to the change, I think the analysis could be even deeper. I personally ask a stupid question like, how Chinese is contemporary China? Or Chinese, how Chinese is contemporary Chinese higher education? Simon mentioned Chinese education, higher education, and it's basically China borrowed, China imported the Western model. So particularly when you ask how Chinese it is, particularly in terms of its underlying cultural values. So when we analyze, I think it's quite important to, it's in reality, it's actually not really working. You know, when we analyze, we need to look at the differences, the so-called Western or Anglo-Saxon traditions, the so-called Chinese traditions. When we analyze, we need to separate them. In the Chinese reality, the actuality is they are all together. They are all together. And sometimes it's very difficult, including the highly educated, the Chinese, the political and intellectual elites. They cannot cannot separate them. And I just, 2 days ago, I read an article, which was a speech by a Peking University professor, Chinese language professor, Wen Ruming. He delivered a talk in Qingdao University 10 years ago, more than 10, slightly more than 10 years ago. I think it's still relevant, largely still the case. He summarized a few phenomena. of the Chinese contemporary higher education. He called serious illness 6, just quickly. One is marketization, 市场化. Another one is 项目化生存, that is project-based survival. You know, if you look at the Chinese higher education, almost all policies are projects. And some they even more project than others. They call project 985, project 211, all project. And that project means what? Means it's top-down, government-led, driven by money, and the money mainly because of government. Of course, and local government also contributed, and increasingly industry also contributed, but all controlled by the government very much. The third one he called 平面化. It's really hard to translate. Flatten or planarization, something like that. 平面化. The fourth one is 官场化, officialdom. The 官场化. Chinese university almost like government, what I usually call an arm of the government. And the last one he called 多动症, ADHD, you know, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, you know, the Chinese. So if you look at these 6, how Chinese are they? How Western are they? They are just the mess in China. So and therefore to China, it's a kind of a juxtaposition of these 2 very different value systems. And Simon, Rose, and you're all familiar with what I have been saying for years. This juxtaposition has created a huge problem for the system, for the institutions and people within. Well, the situation largely, I would argue, exists also in many non-Western societies. Within this kind of situation, Lili mentioned you borrow. I actually admire Xin's 3 steps, you know, transpositional approach. So let's cite China to see the 3 approaches. The first step, the 3 steps. The first step, rejection of single central standpoint. China already achieved, obviously. The second, 2 positions, and Lili, you mentioned in your article, clearly said in China's case, they have 2, Anglo-Saxon and Chinese. China done. China has finished that. The third one is you call development of something. I call dependent of, you know, formation of, or development of transpositionality. That has not been done. And whether or not China can achieve that, that's still, to me, it's a huge question. In my publication, I call this, it's a specter haunting China over a century. The specter is still active. The specter is still there. However, I have to say, if you look at the past development, infrastructure, material, physical, and also software, China has never been in a better position to get the mix correct. Thank you. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yang Rui. A lovely kind of provocation back to Simon and Lili. So what I'm going to do is open the, perhaps I'm going to open the chat so that we're able to draw some of the comments in from the chat and then ask Simon and Lili to respond. So the comment that Yang Rui is raising is how Chinese is contemporary China. There was a second comment in the chat, which is actually, is it possible to represent in the way in which you've done the Anglo-American system and particularly the Anglo system, if we look at the English version specifically, and that comes from several of our colleagues, Peter and Michael, raising those kinds of questions. In other words, you know, is the typology kind of almost kind of too typologized to actually say anything useful? And then the third question, it seems to me, is well, related to that, how the Chinese model. Would you like to respond, to those provocations? Simon, Lili?
Would you like to start, Simon? If you want me to start, I'm happy to do that. So in terms of the first one, how Chinese is a contemporary Chinese system, I think Professor Yang, you are in a better position to really respond to your own question. I would say that, as you mentioned, we can see a lot of Western a lot of characteristics that how higher education system in China has imported the Western models and Western ideas. But I would say that, and you already argued previously, there is a big question of how we integrate the Western model and the Chinese indigenous knowledges. And we still can see a lot of Chinese indigenous knowledge and traditions, how they are manifested in state's higher education system in China. For example, we know that the universities are organized in the corporate model or the governance model following the Western ways, but there are still the unique characteristics. For example, how the party state is need to be balanced with the university system, and also how faculty members and admin staff are operating their daily work. All of these can reflect Chinese way of living their lives and their attitudes towards societies, towards state. But of course, there is a question of how we tackle the disintegration, and that perhaps I don't have a good answer, but I would say that is something we all need to work on that. And of course, the more researchers and scholars work on that, the more likely that we will have a better solution in future. And then in terms of the different strands within the Chinese and Western and Anglo-American knowledges and traditions, I'd say that we definitely acknowledge that. And of course, in China, there were also, in addition to Confucianism, there are also Buddhism, Taoism, etc. And for Anglo-American, we are primarily looking at liberal ideas, liberal thesis. And as comments have said in the chat box, that in the UK and in the US, they are different. But because of the scope that we are trying to look at the mainstream philosophers, liberal philosophers' ideas, and there are some limitations, but perhaps Simon has a better response to that. You're muted, Simon.
Thank you for telling me. Saved a bit of time. Yang raised a point about the need to look at the evolution of the ideas as well as the static picture is a very good one. And I think the point about diachronic was made by John Hofford as well. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And we would write a better paper if we did that. We'd write a longer paper, of course, and that's part of the limitation that we're in. But you know, we would deepen the analysis. In terms of the character of Chinese higher education, I say this as an outsider and a very keen, interested observer. You know, you've got I called it a hybrid of Leninism, Americanism, and Chinese tradition in its ancient and less ancient and modern forms. But hybrid is perhaps too an integrative, too polished and finished, isn't it? I mean, there's a strong element of multiplicity, fragmentation, tension. You know, these things are all swirling around together. And yet, of course, there's enormous success and achievement and development going on. The hardest questions to answer are the ones about the future and where it's all going. But clearly, it's capable of many different outcomes in future. And that's what makes it really interesting. And it seems to me that two thoughts. One is that I think the pressure to be mimetic, to be imitative, the pressure of the catch-up process will diminish over time as China's place in the world is unequivocal and established already and will become more so in the longer term. I think the present military confrontation might inhibit that process, but only to a degree and not for very long in the last analysis. So China can be more China if you like. It's freer to be China as time goes on. But a lot will depend on whether there's a reflexivity that takes people back to traditional scholarship and plumbing the well of extraordinary knowledge and thought and the different, you know, currents of thought, the diversity that Ruth talked about, the different arguments that also Xin referred to. I mean, going back to that body of work and taking that forward is immensely important, because there's more there than perhaps there is in the Judeo-Christian tradition in terms of surviving scholarship and depth. I mean, most of the Roman and Greek world was lost when the early Christians destroyed it around the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries. The monasteries only maintained about 5% of the Latin scholarship and 20% of the Greek scholarship. Most of it was lost. More survived in China, and there's more respect for tradition in China. It's an immense resource. But will modern education take people back to that? Will only a few scholars pursue it, or will many, many people think about those themes in future? If they do, then China can be more China, one would think. On the question of diversity, in relation to this discussion about whether we've got the Anglo-American world right and whether the distinctions between the US and England ought to be given more importance, and whether the US is very diverse and so on. Of course, if your compass or your lens is on the US, it's immensely diverse. Not as diverse as India, but immensely diverse. If your compass is on the English-speaking world, there's a lot of difference between the UK and America. But if your compass is on the world as a whole, tianxia, thinking through the world, then the difference between China and the West jumps out as much larger, much more important probably than the difference between England and America. And the things that we focused on here were the things which England and America arguably have in common. This notion of division of powers, limited liberal state, and so on. And that brings me to Peter's point in the chat, about, look, this overbearing authoritarian UK state. And of course, I've got some sympathy with that. I think within the English-speaking world, the UK state can be very brutal and it's very centralising and quite interventionist, but it's within the terms of the Western settlement, if you like. I mean, it was Gramsci who made the point that the division of powers is essential to this model, but when the chips are down and the state and capitalism is in trouble, then the state becomes very coercive, very centralising when it needs to. It ceases to be the submerged state, as the US state classically is, and becomes very, very effective in action. And of course, Roosevelt's New Deal, the war effort and so on, those times are when you see the state come right, throw off the disguise and come out into the open. But most of the time it doesn't behave like that. In England, I think there's centralisation, but it's still a liberal state. I mean, we complain about centralisation and intervention in higher education from within the terms of a settlement where the universities are seen to be naturally autonomous and naturally separate from the state. Now in China, they're always embedded in the state. That's the difference. They're always there and they have autonomy within the state. They don't have autonomy from the state. And that difference, of course, at a system level is all important. I suppose what I'd say to my colleagues in the English-speaking world is, look, try to engage with a much more different culture than the differences within the West. Try to deal with that. I mean, I think that's what we've tried to do here. Don't just look at that other culture through your own lens. Try to use that other culture as a lens to look at your culture, and you will find it looks different. It's just another culture. It's not the normal. It's just another culture. And they all are, they all are. And we will understand India. We will understand Arabic culture. We will understand Latin America, all of the other cultures better if we can make that kind of essential move out of the West into another headspace. And that's what we've tried to do here.
So thank you, Simon. I'm aware of time, and I'm also aware that the papers are out there. So there's a very nice question for Xin Xu, but that's from Victoria, and you might actually read Xu's paper and direct specifically a question to her, perhaps through another source of the media. Ruth, I'm aware you made some wonderful comments, and your paper is also out there. So I'm actually just going to draw it to a close. I want to say thank you to both Simon and to Lili. I want to say thank you to Ruth, to Xu, and to Yang Rui. I want to just announce the fact that there will be a recording of today that will go out onto the centre's website, and just to announce next week, so tune in next week at the same time, and it will be, the title of it is called Environmental Shocks in Higher Education. How did an earthquake and air pollution influence college access and graduate mobility? And actually that's on Tuesday, not on Thursday. So thank you so much. Thank you, Simon, and for the opportunity to chair this session as an extraordinary event in the sense that you're normally in the chair, but I've enjoyed the opportunity to do this and have absolutely welcomed the opportunity as an editor, one of the editors-in-chief of the journal Globalisation, Societies and Education, to pull together a special issue on a really important topic about how to place our lenses in other places in order to see our worlds differently. Thank you.